I'm Lisa, 29, and until recently I thought I had my life all figured out. I was engaged to Tom, who I'd been dating for 3 years. He's 32, charming, good-looking, and the kind of guy who lights up a room. When he proposed last year during a weekend getaway, it felt like a dream. My family was thrilled, my friends gushed over the ring, and I was over the moon. We set the wedding date for a year later and started planning. I wanted something small but elegant. About 100 guests, nothing over the top, but still beautiful. I was doing most of the planning since Tom was always busy. He's in finance, and his job seemed to take up most of his time. He said he trusted my taste, which was flattering at first. I thought it was sweet that he wanted me to have everything exactly how I envisioned. But as the weeks turned into months, his "I'm too busy with work" excuse started to feel like a pattern. Tom missed a cake tasting appointment that we'd scheduled weeks in advance. No text, no call, just didn't show up. When I asked him about it later, he apologized but didn't offer much of an explanation. Work ran late was all he said. He seemed distracted, and I told myself it was just pre-wedding stress. Everyone says planning a wedding is tough on couples, right? I brushed it off, but in the back of my mind, a tiny seed of doubt was planted. Around that time, I noticed Tom's texts became shorter and less frequent. He used to send me random messages during the day, funny memes, or just a quick thinking of you. Now I was lucky if I got a busy call later. When I brought it up, he said things at work were crazy, but he promised it would settle down soon. I believed him because, well, why wouldn't I? My family, though, started to notice things I wasn't ready to see. My mom casually mentioned that Tom didn't seem as engaged in the wedding planning as he should be. My sister pointed out how he seemed distracted even during family dinners. I defended him every time. He's under a lot of pressure at work, I'd say. It'll be fine once the wedding's over. But their concerns stayed with me, even if I didn't want to admit it. Then there was the bachelor party. Tom insisted on having one, which is normal, but the people he invited weren't his usual group of friends. These were coworkers and guys I didn't really know. When I asked why his usual friends weren't coming, he said they couldn't make it, but it felt off. He reassured me it was just going to be a low-key night. I didn't push further, but something about the whole thing left me uneasy. A week before the wedding, everything fell apart. Tom stopped responding to my texts and calls. At first, I thought maybe his phone was broken or he was caught up in something urgent. But as the hours turned into a full day, panic set in. I tried his work phone, no answer. I called his family. They were just as confused as I was. His mom said she hadn't heard from him in days. By the second day, I was frantic. I drove to his apartment, praying I'd find him there and that this was all some big misunderstanding. Instead, I found his place completely cleaned out. No furniture, no clothes, not even a note. It was as if he'd vanished overnight. I stood there in shock, trying to process what I was seeing. My fiancé, the man I was supposed to marry in a week, had disappeared without a trace. I had no choice but to cancel the wedding. Making those calls was one of the most humiliating experiences of my life. Explaining to family and friends why the wedding was off without having any answers myself felt like tearing my heart out repeatedly. Everyone was supportive, but the pity in their voices was unbearable. My dad offered to take care of contacting the vendors, which I was grateful for because I couldn't handle it. The real blow came a few days later when a mutual friend reached out. She told me she'd seen Tom with another woman at a restaurant the night before he disappeared. According to her, they looked very cozy, like a couple. I didn't want to believe it, but the pieces started falling into place. The missed texts, the distractions, the bachelor party with people I didn't know, it all made sense now. Anger replaced my heartbreak. I couldn't let this slide. After everything he put me through, I wasn't going to just sit quietly and let him get away with it. I started digging into his recent movements, checking social media, and reaching out to anyone who might know what he was up to. I wasn't just going to let him ghost me after humiliating me in front of everyone we knew. That's when I realized I had leverage. Tom's name was on several of the contracts for the wedding, including the catering bill, which was significant. If he thought he could just walk away without consequences, he was in for a rude awakening. I wasn't just hurt, I was determined. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Update 1, it didn't take long to find her. A little social media stalking led me to Rachel, the woman Tom had been seen with. She wasn't trying to hide, her profiles were wide open, filled with photos of her and Tom smiling together at dinners and events. They looked like a couple who had been dating for months, not someone he had just started seeing. The timestamps on the pictures made it clear this wasn't new. While I was busy planning our wedding, he was taking her on dates. It felt like a slap in the face. As I dug deeper, mutual friends started reaching out. Some were hesitant, clearly uncomfortable, but one finally spilled the truth. Tom had been telling people we broke up months ago. He painted me as the clingy ex who couldn't accept the breakup, which explained why Rachel wasn't questioning his behavior. In her eyes, he was single. It was like he had rewritten history, erasing everything we had built together and making me look desperate. I remembered the contracts with Tom's name on them, the venue, the catering, and a few other big-ticket items. Legally, he was still tied to everything. I contacted the vendors, confirming that his signature was on every agreement. If those bills went unpaid, they'd come after both of us, but I saw an opportunity. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about making sure he faced the consequences of what he had done. I wasn't going to let him walk away from this mess unscathed. I found out where he was staying, Rachel's apartment, of course, and decided to confront him. When I knocked, there was no answer, but I could hear movement inside. It was obvious they were ignoring me. I waited for a while, knocking louder, but nothing. I left feeling more determined than ever. He wasn't going to keep running from this. I messaged Rachel directly, hoping she'd at least listen. I kept it polite and factual, explaining how Tom had ghosted me a week before our wedding and left me to clean up the mess. She read the message but didn't respond right away. Hours later, she sent a curt reply, accusing me of being a jealous ex who couldn't let go. Clearly, Tom had her completely convinced. It was infuriating, but it also gave me an idea. I started posting updates on social media, carefully worded so they wouldn't violate any rules or come across as petty. I talked about being ghosted before my wedding, and how I discovered my fiancé had been seeing someone else. I didn't name names, but the posts gained traction quickly. Friends, acquaintances, and even strangers began commenting and messaging me with support. Some shared their own stories of betrayal, while others offered advice. The attention made me feel less alone, but more importantly, it started turning the narrative in my favor. A few days later, I decided to hire a private investigator. I needed more information, proof of how long this had been going on, and anything else I could use to protect myself legally. It didn't take long for the investigator to deliver results. Tom and Rachel had been seeing each other for at least 6 months. There were receipts from restaurants, hotel bookings, and even a weekend getaway they had taken while Tom told me he was on a work trip. The level of deception was staggering. The investigator also uncovered something useful. Tom was in financial trouble. Despite his job in finance, he was drowning in credit card debt. Knowing this gave me leverage. The wedding contracts were worth more than he could afford if he had to pay them alone. I started setting up a plan, leaving a few loose ends in our shared accounts to see if he'd make a move. It didn't take long for Tom to slip up. He tried to withdraw money from one of our joint accounts, triggering an alert I had set up. That gave me the perfect opportunity to lock down the account and ensure he couldn't touch it again. It was satisfying, but the real drama came when his parents called me. They begged me not to ruin his life, claiming he was going through a hard time. The audacity was unreal. I told them this was his mess to deal with and hung up. Meanwhile, Rachel started noticing cracks in Tom's story. My posts were gaining traction, and mutual friends were talking. She started asking questions, and when she didn't get clear answers, she messaged me again. This time, she wanted details. I didn't hold back, sharing the evidence I had gathered. She didn't reply immediately, but I could tell she was starting to doubt him. I decided to take things a step further. I released screenshots of incriminating messages and emails from Tom. These weren't private conversations, but rather proof of his lies, canceling wedding plans while claiming he was still committed. The reaction was explosive. People who had initially doubted my side of the story came forward to apologize, and Tom's reputation started to crumble. By the end of the week, he had deleted his social media accounts entirely. Every move I made felt like taking back control piece by piece. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about standing up for myself and refusing to let Tom rewrite the narrative. He thought he could ghost me and walk away, but he underestimated how determined I could be. Update 2. The first major consequence for Tom came from the catering company. After confirming that his name was still on the contract, I reached out to them and explained the situation. They were sympathetic but firm. The bill had to be paid, and they didn't care about the drama. Since Tom had signed the agreement, they began pursuing him directly for the full amount. When I shared this update online, people cheered, and some even joked about karma coming for him. The catering company sent formal notices, and I later heard from a mutual friend that Tom was panicking. He couldn't afford it, and he knew it. Not long after, I decided to take things a step further. Using a throwaway email, I tipped off Tom's employer about his behavior. I wasn't petty about it. I focused on how he had lied about work trips and potentially misused company resources. A week later, I heard through the grapevine that his company had launched an internal investigation. Whatever they found must have been serious because, shortly after, Tom was fired. It wasn't just about losing his job, it was about losing the credibility he had always flaunted. While all this was happening, Rachel finally confronted Tom with the evidence I'd shared. According to a friend who stayed in touch with her, the confrontation didn't go well for him. She had pieced together the timeline and realized he'd been lying to her the entire time they were together. Within days, Rachel broke up with him. She deleted all their photos from social media and even posted a cryptic message about how people show their true colors when you least expect it. It didn't take a genius to figure out who she was talking about. As my posts continued gaining traction online, Tom became a target for widespread criticism. Strangers were calling him out in the comments, and people started sharing screenshots of messages where he had tried to defend himself. But his attempts to shift the narrative only made things worse. The internet wasn't buying it, and every post he made was flooded with comments dragging him for his actions. Tom's problems didn't stop there. I found out he was evicted from his new apartment after failing to pay rent on. He had been relying on Rachel's income to cover most of the expenses, and once she left, he couldn't keep up. When he moved out, he left behind a mess, literally and figuratively. His landlord wasn't shy about sharing that he owed months of rent and damages. It wasn't hard to imagine Tom scrambling to figure out his next move. Even his family seemed to have had enough. His parents stopped defending him publicly after my posts went viral. They were embarrassed by his actions and the attention they were getting. Mutual friends said they'd been distancing themselves from him, avoiding calls and refusing to bail him out financially. It was clear Tom was running out of allies. Around this time, I decided to take legal action. I filed a small claims case against him for emotional distress and the wedding-related costs I had been left to cover. He tried to counter, claiming my social media posts had ruined his reputation and cost him his job. But the evidence was on my side. In court, it was clear he had no case. The judge ruled in my favor, and I was awarded financial compensation. It wasn't just about the money, it was about making it clear that his actions had real consequences. Rachel eventually reached out to me. She apologized for doubting me and admitted that Tom had been manipulative during their relationship, too. She shared some of her own experiences, which only confirmed what I already knew about his behavior. It felt like a full circle moment, knowing she was finally free from his lies. As more people heard my story, I continued sharing updates online, warning others about red flags in relationships. The response was overwhelming. People reached out to thank me, share their own stories, and offer support. Some even sent care packages and letters, which was heartwarming. It reminded me that I wasn't alone in this. Meanwhile, Tom's isolation grew. Friends and colleagues cut ties with him, and his name started coming up in conversations as a cautionary tale. He was struggling to find new work because his reputation had taken such a massive hit. At one point, someone messaged me to let me know that Tom was applying to jobs under a different name, trying to escape the fallout. The final blow came when I worked with a local group to add Tom's name to a dating app blacklist. It wasn't just about my experience, others had started coming forward with similar stories. The goal was to protect people from falling into the same trap. Knowing he couldn't use these platforms without being flagged felt like the perfect ending to this chapter. Looking back, it's incredible how quickly things spiraled for him once the truth came out. Every lie he told, every bridge he burned, came back to haunt him. Meanwhile, I found strength in the support of my community and the lessons I've learned. This was never the life I planned, but I'm determined to make the most of it, and to ensure that people like Tom can't continue their cycles of manipulation unchecked. Update 3. Not long after everything went public, I received an unexpected email. A small business owner reached out, saying they were impressed by how I handled the situation and admired my resilience. They offered me a role in their company, which involved project management and public relations, skills I didn't even realize I had honed, while dealing with the aftermath of Tom's betrayal. It felt surreal to turn such a painful experience into an opportunity, but I accepted the offer. Starting fresh in a new role felt like a step in the right direction. Around the same time, a local journalist contacted me. They had seen my social media posts and wanted to cover the story for a piece on relationship red flags and resilience. I agreed under anonymity. The article went live a week later, and the response was overwhelming. Readers were inspired by my determination, and many shared their own experiences in the comments section. The support was incredible, but the article also brought unwanted attention from Tom. Tom tried reaching out to me multiple times after the article went live. He emailed me, claiming he wanted to clear the air and begging for a truce. I didn't respond. He even tried calling from a blocked number, but I recognized his voice and hung up immediately. It was clear he was desperate, but I had nothing left to say to him. Meanwhile, Rachel decided to share her own story online. She detailed how Tom had lied to her, manipulated her, and even tried to shift blame for his mistakes onto her. Her post went viral, further tarnishing his reputation. As more people heard about what happened, I started connecting with individuals who admired how I had handled everything. A few of them were professionals in industries I had never imagined being a part of. They invited me to events, introduced me to influential people, and opened doors I didn't even know existed. It was empowering to turn a horrible experience into something positive, not just for me but for others as well. Through mutual connections, I learned that Tom was considering filing for bankruptcy. His financial troubles had caught up with him, and he had no way of paying off the debts he had accumulated. It was a fitting consequence for someone who had tried to walk away from all responsibility. Around the same time, I started dating someone new. We met through mutual friends at a casual get-together, and things just clicked. He was kind, supportive, and the complete opposite of Tom in all the right ways. It was refreshing to be with someone who valued honesty and mutual respect. One day, someone sent me a photo of Tom that had been circulating online. He was working a minimum wage job at a fast food restaurant, looking unkempt and exhausted. While I didn't take joy in his struggles, it was a stark reminder of how far he had fallen. The life he had tried so hard to maintain through lies and manipulation was gone, and he had no one to blame but himself. Rachel, on the other hand, was thriving. After breaking up with Tom, she started a business venture she had been planning for years. It took off quickly, and she even reached out to thank me for helping her see Tom's true colors. It felt good to know that she was doing well and moving on from the mess he had created. For me, rebuilding my life meant reflecting on everything I had learned. I started setting firmer boundaries and recognizing the red flags I had ignored in the past. My story became a cautionary tale, shared widely on social media and in conversations about self-respect and resilience. People who had initially doubted me were now using my experience as an example of why it's important to trust your instincts and stand up for yourself. A mutual friend later shared that Tom had expressed deep regret for everything he had done. He admitted he had made terrible choices and wished he could undo them. But his regret didn't move me. Actions have consequences, and he was finally facing his. I had no interest in hearing his excuses or apologies. The turning point came when my new partner and I attended an event where I was celebrated for my resilience. The room was filled with people who had supported me, shared my story, or been inspired by it. It was a moment of closure, knowing that I had turned one of the worst experiences of my life into something meaningful. Strangers continued to reach out, thanking me for sharing my journey and helping them see their own relationships more clearly. While I appreciated the support, I knew it was time to move forward. I deleted my final post about Tom, officially closing that chapter of my life. Life now feels like a fresh start. I'm focused on my career, my relationship, and the people who truly matter. What happened with Tom was painful, but it taught me the importance of resilience and the value of standing up for myself. I may never forget what happened, but I've made peace with it. Moving forward is the best revenge, and I'm determined to make the most of this new chapter. Update 4. Out of nowhere, I received an email from Tom. It was long and filled with what he must have thought were heartfelt apologies. He claimed his actions stemmed from childhood trauma and a fear of commitment. He described feeling overwhelmed by the pressure of the wedding and insisted he had made mistakes but was ready to take responsibility. He wanted to clear the air and hoped we could have an honest conversation. The email was full of emotional language, clearly designed to tug at my heartstrings. I deleted it without responding. Shortly after, Tom took things public. He posted a lengthy apology on social media, addressing me indirectly and admitting he had made serious mistakes in our relationship. He called himself a work in progress and talked about wanting to make amends. The reaction was far from what he probably expected. Most people saw through the post, accusing him of seeking sympathy rather than accountability. Some even dug into his past, uncovering more lies he had told to others. The backlash was swift and harsh, leaving his attempt at redemption in shambles. Not long after, Rachel reached out with another warning. She had learned that Tom was contacting other women from his past, spinning similar sob stories about how he had been misunderstood and mistreated. He was trying to rebuild his reputation by gaining sympathy from people who didn't know the full story. Rachel even shared screenshots of messages he had sent her, where he tried to play the victim. It was clear he hadn't changed at all. To get a clearer picture, I followed up with the private investigator I had hired earlier. They confirmed that Tom was still living beyond his means, racking up debt, despite having no stable income. He had maxed out multiple credit cards and was relying on friends to cover basic expenses. The investigator also discovered that Tom had been couch surfing after being evicted again. His situation was unraveling quickly, but instead of taking responsibility, he was blaming me for ruining his life. Mutual friends started sharing updates about Tom's sob stories. He had been calling people, pleading for help, and accusing me of being vindictive. Most of them weren't buying it, but a few reached out to me, concerned about his mental state. I made it clear that I wanted no part in his drama and asked them not to share any more updates about him with me. Around this time, his public apology started to circulate online again, drawing more criticism. People dissected his words, pointing out inconsistencies and exposing even more of his lies. Then, things took a turn I wasn't expecting. Tom showed up unannounced at my workplace. He claimed he wanted to make amends and start fresh. My coworkers were confused, and security had to escort him out when he refused to leave. It was the last straw for me. I filed a restraining order the next day, ensuring he couldn't contact me or come near my workplace again. The legal action sent a clear message that I was done tolerating his attempts to insert himself back into my life. The restraining order seemed to be the final nail in the coffin for Tom's social presence. After it was granted, he disappeared from social media entirely. Friends who had been following the situation told me they hadn't heard from him directly in weeks. Word spread that he was living out of his car, struggling to make ends meet. Meanwhile, Rachel decided to post the screenshots of his manipulative messages online, adding even more credibility to her story. People rallied around her, commending her bravery for speaking out. As for me, I focused on setting boundaries. I told my friends and family that I didn't want to hear any more updates about Tom. I needed to move on completely. The support I received from my community was overwhelming. People messaged me, encouraging me to prioritize my peace and congratulating me on standing up for myself. It was a reminder that I wasn't alone, and that helped me feel more empowered. After the restraining order and Rachel's posts, Tom's presence faded entirely. His name stopped coming up in conversations, and his social media accounts remained inactive. No one seemed to know where he had gone or what he was doing, and honestly, I didn't care to find out. It felt like the universe had finally closed the book on him. For the first time in what felt like forever, I could focus solely on myself and the life I was building. The chapter with Tom was over, and I wasn't looking back. Update 5. Life flourished in ways I never imagined after cutting Tom out for good. My new job provided a fresh start, and I quickly found myself thriving in a supportive environment. My relationship with my new partner deepened as we grew closer, and for the first time in years, I felt genuinely happy. Our weekends were spent exploring new places, cooking together, and building a life that felt safe and fulfilling. My career took off, with new opportunities coming my way, thanks to connections I had made during the storm of my public ordeal. Rachel also found her footing. Her business venture gained traction, becoming a success story that inspired many. One day, I received a handwritten note from her. She thanked me for helping her escape Tom's manipulative grip and for sharing my story, which had empowered her to reclaim her life. It was a heartwarming reminder of how far we'd both come. News about Tom eventually filtered back to me. Through a third party, I learned he had moved out of state, unable to recover socially or financially. His reputation was in ruins, and he couldn't find stable work. The person who had once seemed so untouchable was now a shadow of himself, living in anonymity far from the life he used to boast about. Around this time, I made a symbolic gesture that felt like the final step in closing this chapter. I donated my old wedding dress to a charity that helps underprivileged brides. Letting go of that dress, something that once represented so much pain, turned into a moment of joy. Knowing it would bring happiness to someone else made it all the more meaningful. Rachel continued to thrive, and not long after, she announced her engagement. Her fiancé was someone who treated her with kindness and respect, a sharp contrast to her past. I couldn't have been happier for her. She sent me an invitation to the wedding, and while I wasn't ready to attend another wedding just yet, I sent her a heartfelt message congratulating her on the fresh start she deserved. As for me, I found peace in the simplest things: walking my dog, spending time with my friends, and learning to trust again. I started receiving messages from people who had followed my story thanking me for sharing it. Some told me it had given them the strength to leave toxic relationships. While I appreciated their kindness, I began sharing fewer updates, wanting to focus on my own life rather than revisiting the past. Eventually, my partner and I decided to move in together. It felt like a natural step, symbolizing the fresh start we were building together. Our new home was cozy and filled with love, a stark contrast to the chaos I had endured with Tom. It was a reminder that life doesn't just move on, it can get so much better. Months later, I heard through a mutual friend that Tom was trying to rebuild his reputation in his new city. He had started using a different name professionally, but the efforts weren't going well. People were skeptical, and word of his past behavior seemed to follow him. It didn't matter much to me. By then, I had moved on so completely that hearing about him felt like hearing about a stranger. To mark my personal growth, I wrote a private letter to myself. In it, I acknowledged how far I'd come and released any lingering anger or resentment toward Tom. It wasn't for him, it was for me. Letting go felt liberating, like I had finally closed the door on a chapter that no longer served me. Rachel and I stayed in touch, bonded by the shared experience of escaping Tom's manipulation. We occasionally exchanged updates, supporting each other in our respective journeys. Our friendship was a silver lining to what had been a dark period in our lives. Tom's name eventually faded into obscurity. Among our old social circles, he became a cautionary tale about the dangers of deceit and selfishness. People stopped talking about him altogether, and his story was replaced by new ones. He had become irrelevant, just another person who couldn't outrun the consequences of his actions. As for me, I decided to turn my pain into purpose. I began mentoring young women about recognizing red flags in relationships and standing up for themselves. Using my story as an example, I helped others find their voice and build self-respect. This passion project grew into a platform for sharing stories of resilience, a space where people could feel supported and empowered. Life has blossomed in ways I couldn't have imagined. My career is thriving, my relationship is strong, and I've built a community of people who inspire me every day. What happened with Tom will always be a part of my story, but it no longer defines me. Instead, it serves as a reminder of my strength and the life I was able to rebuild. Looking forward, I'm excited about the possibilities. I've learned to trust myself, embrace new opportunities, and surround myself with people who truly care. The past is behind me, and the future feels brighter than ever.